So I have recently been reading this book called Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Part of the reason that I thought the title of this book was so interesting is because I've recently been feeling a little bit of a challenge deciding on what I want to do with my life and in my life, and I realize that I'm coming at this from a pretty privileged position, but there have been some instances in the very, very recent past where I felt somewhat devoid of purpose at times and a little bit lost. I was spending too much time online, having trouble at my new job, didn't feel like I really had a mentor or anyone solid that I could turn to in order to talk about these issues. And I've noticed this kind of general internal level of frustration at times just moving through the world and trying to find my place in it. I think everyone kind of goes through this at some point in their life. As the first part of the book is titled, I was feeling a certain level of male malaise, trying to find out, what is my purpose here? So this book specifically really kind of spoke to me, and I've been hearing a lot about it over the past year on various podcasts that I listen to, and I thought, now is the time to read it. Maybe it'll give me some insight into myself. Maybe it'll educate me on issues that I don't really know much about. I've also found myself following some mildly concerning trends that scare me a little bit. Firstly, I moved back with my parents instead of living independently, mainly because I decided to try out a pretty high-risk career. I wanted to keep my expenses low, and the option was open to me, so I decided to take it. However, I do find myself worrying sometimes that things just aren't going to work out. I'll end up living with my parents until the rest of time, or they'll kick me out, none of which I would really want to happen. I think the best way to explain why I'm concerned about living at home is a quote from Dave Ramsey from The Ramsey Show. And it goes something like, an eagle that doesn't leave the nest becomes a turkey. And I don't want to be a turkey. I'm in general also finding that the number of people that I can have these types of deep or important conversations with is shrinking over time rather than expanding. I think this happens a little bit as you go into adulthood, but I still feel like, I'm pretty young. I just don't really seem to be able to make or maintain friendships as well as I probably should. Part of that is purely my problem. In order to iron out the type of person that you want to be, it's important to have people that you can have life conversations with so that you can sort of understand what your value systems are, understand what's important to you, and sometimes just having a sounding board or someone else to kind of bounce ideas off of is really helpful. It's concerning to me to realize that, if I don't put in the work, it's possible that down the line, I might have one or maybe two people that I can talk to about important things, whereas in the past I may have had 5 or 6. You also don't want to be relying on just 1 or 2 people, and you don't want to be relying on the internet especially to try to solve your problems, because it puts a drain on that person, and the internet is just a rabbit hole, and you can go in some pretty weird places. Another interesting thing that I've been hearing in the media is this whole loneliness epidemic that we're experiencing as a society, but especially young men. After hearing about this book right around the same time that the news of this epidemic was happening, and I was like, hey, this is a timely topic. It makes sense to pick up the book, give it a read, and see what the author thinks. I really did think after reading the book that it has some super cool and interesting insights into data that shows how a lot of young men are feeling nowadays, and this problem of kind of struggling boys and men, specifically below the median, bottom 50%, are going somewhat unnoticed because we have barely had time to process all of the sudden and amazing victories that women have had with respect to their rights. So we barely had time to process that, and now coming down the other side is a completely different problem. Briefly, before I go on to talk about the book, I do feel the need, like the author of the book, Richard Reeves, did, to say that there is still a long way to go for women's rights and women's equality. To put it succinctly by quoting him from the book, we can hold 2 thoughts in our head at once. We can be passionate about women's rights and compassionate towards vulnerable boys and men. By talking about the problems facing boys and men, I'm not ignoring the fact that women have fought extremely hard for all of the freedom that they have gained and still have a ways to go towards true equality. But their trajectory is on the up and up, while men's trajectory over the past 50 years has actually gotten worse over time, especially and most significantly when you look at the people that I mentioned before in below the median. He also does point out that men who are at the top of their game are doing even better than ever, so we're not really concerned or talking about the people who are extremely successful. but more so the people who are struggling in the bottom half. This isn't going to be a traditional book summary where I just kind of go over everything. I am going to summarize some parts of it, but I want it to be a little bit more of like a discussion you might have in a classroom or like an expansion, and just to talk about kind of my experience, what I see in the media, and what I see reflected in the broader world as it pertains to the things that he talks about in the book. So in the first part of the book, he talks about the growing education gap between men and women. He specifically points out that in 1972, the gap between men and women who obtained bachelor's degree was 13% in favor of men. And then there was something called Title IX, which was passed in the US to encourage women to get more education. And they have done so well that in 2019, the gap is now 15%, but it's in favor of women and growing. He points to the fact that a good part of this gap is due to the different speeds at which boys and girls mature in K-12 schooling. There are significant neurological differences between boys and girls. I quote, "The parts of the brain that manage impulse control, planning, future orientation are mostly in the prefrontal cortex, which matures about 2 years later for boys than for girls." He also mentions that the cerebellum, which has a modulating effect on emotions, cognitive and regulatory capacities, matures at 11 for girls, but not until 15 for boys. So the ability for boys to say, yeah, let's go party versus I need to study and get good grades develops at a much slower pace. He also points out something called this like averaging bias, where in many cases there is huge overlap between whether it's development rates, whether it's ways that men and women think, are huge overlaps. If you take averages, those averages will be different, but the Venn diagrams sometimes overlap more than 50%. Not everybody is going to fall into this average or median category. Generally speaking, boys are more impulsive, have less regulation over their emotions, and thus require more guidance at a young age to stay on track than maybe an equivalent girl might. He also proposes at the end of the book to redshirt the boys, which effectively means start them in school a full year later than girls to narrow this developmental gap. And there have been some pilot projects that have tried to do this and that have proven to be actually quite successful, especially when it comes to reading comprehension for boys. He also mentions a growing trend among more affluent people that are actually starting to proactively hold their boys back by a year and put them in school a year later so that they actually can develop at a different pace. But obviously you need the resources able to keep them at home instead of putting them into the school system, because that's effectively daycare. He proposes a different plan that would include the whole population that's actually quite interesting and addresses these developmental differences. He also points out that biology sometimes gets ignored when we try to apply a broad brushstroke to a population and effectively get every single student learning the exact same thing at the exact same time. And I actually wrote a blog post, which you can find at oliverfoote.ca, talking about trades in Ontario, and I specifically mention how trades were taken out of classrooms, standardized testing was increased, and around the same time you saw this trend of fewer people in general enrolling in these courses, and boys tend to do much better, he points out, in vocational schools as a whole. And effectively by removing different ways for people to gain a different form of education, because not everybody is the same, we are limiting the possibilities for boys and we're leaving some people behind. By systematizing our education systems, we inevitably will leave some people behind, and grade distributions show that the way the school system is currently set up for learning leaves boys behind. Anecdotally, from my own experience in high school, I remember there was a special category for students who scored an above average of 90% in their whole school year. While I don't have the data for this, I do recall that a large percentage of the top performers were female. And in the book, Richard Reeves shows actual data from 2009 on the GPAs of freshman students in high school, or grade 9 if you live in the rest of the world. And 2/3 of the top 10% were female, while 1/3 were male. And in the bottom 10%, the ratio was flipped. So more males underperforming by 2/3 than women. The reason that he chose freshmen as a data sample is because this tends to predict GPA as you go throughout high school, and I'm going to use myself again as a personal case study. I had around a 92% average in grade 9, and my average varied by about 1% throughout the entire rest of my high school education. While the pure numbers do show that women and girls are doing better in school than men, there are still categories where the distributions are highly skewed in either direction. For example, nursing, teaching, healthcare related roles are more female, and he comes up with this acronym called HEAL, which I think is really interesting. STEM, business, skew a little bit more male, although business is becoming very close to 50-50. As an engineering graduate, I can say that I noticed this within my own class, and I also noticed skewing within engineering disciplines. So in biotechnical engineering, for example, or chemical engineering, you would see a larger female proportion. But in software, hardware, computer science-based fields, you saw a much larger proportion of males. And I think in one of my classes, there were about 5 to 6 women for 50 to 60 men. So you had about a 10-to-1 ratio. And in nursing, I'm sure that ratio is probably flipped. So there is something to be said for trying to narrow gaps on both sides, but there is also something to be said for natural preferences and a natural distribution, which he does mention, that if you take a population sample as a whole, men and women are going to naturally gravitate towards different things. Men tend to gravitate towards objects and machinery and things, as he calls it, and women tend to gravitate towards more people-caring type of roles. He puts up an interesting graph which kind of shows what a natural distribution would look like based on preferences that some researchers took, and right now they are still way too skewed female in healthcare and not skewed enough female in engineering and STEM roles. So there is still room for improvement on either side of the distribution to try and get the more natural preference distribution to show up. I find that teaching is also an interesting discussion. Teaching is becoming more and more female, and households nowadays have a larger proportion of single mothers than ever before. Many boys are growing up without a father figure, and when they do go to school, they may find a distinct lack of male role models. I know that some of my favorite teachers were the male teachers in high school because I was kind of looking at them as an example of how to succeed. My father was actually a great example of this because he was a grade 6 teacher for almost his entire career, and I'm sure he had the same impact on some of his students that my teachers did on me. Now, this isn't to discount any of my female teachers by any means because they were also absolutely amazing. If it wasn't for my physics teacher, I probably would not have even considered getting my engineering degree. So I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but I'm just saying that having both gives more options for students to kind of model themselves after. And I think it's easier for someone to look at a teacher who kind of looks like them, is the same gender as them, and say, hey, like, this is how this person is acting. Why don't I try to model that as well? Students are very impressionable, and I think it's important to have representation not just through gender, but also through different cultures and ethnicities. With male teachers dwindling in numbers, I can't really imagine that will have an overall positive impact on boys who are already struggling, especially those who do not have a father figure at home. There was a striking fact that he mentioned about the labor force participation rate in the US. Since 1979, men's participation has fallen by a total of 7 percentage points. That is 9 million men in their prime working years between the ages of 25 and 54 who are just not in the labor force at all, so they're not even looking for work. The largest drop in employment was seen for young men between the ages of 25 and 34, so this is a building problem as we speak. While at the same time, labor force participation for women has shot up significantly to the point where now 47% of the entire labor force is female, and it has effectively doubled economic output and GDP because now we have both sides of the population working, so prosperity is abound in some parts of society. The author attributes some of this due to the fact that many jobs that men held in the past were manufacturing, and those have been slowly automated away or they have been offshored. There is also very little governmental supports to retrain these men into a different role. And I think in 2021 he mentioned that there was an act called the Restart Act, which is a really long acronym that I don't remember much, but effectively put more funding into retraining people that might be transitioning into a STEM role or want to transition out of a STEM role, specifically trying to target this problem that he mentions. But up until that point, there had been very little supports for this kind of retraining program. So a lot of men who might be in a position where they lost a job and they don't have really any transferable skills could end up just languishing, not sure where to turn to improve their skills. And I also know personally that men are less likely to seek help and think that they can do everything on their own, don't need assistance from anyone, which doesn't turn out to be true. Rather than go and ask for help, they would rather just sit at home, be stubborn, and not do anything at all and languish. He also talks about a general fathering problem nowadays, that women effectively don't need men anymore to have a child or raise a child. The role of the father has to change into something that is more on par, more equal to that of which women do. Even if in the earlier years the women take more care of the child, and then in the later years it's more the men's responsibility, whatever it is, as long as people are picking up slack and the distribution of work is kind of equal when it comes to raising a child, he thinks that would kind of be a better approach to doing things. It would kind of give fathers more of a, I guess, purpose within the family that is different from the old, outdated, only breadwinner role. He also does talk about how having a baby is one of the biggest career hurdles for women at the moment. And one of the ways he proposes to deal with this issue is to have a more equal distribution, exactly 50-50 of paternity and maternity leave. Take it or leave it, so it can't be transferred. This way, it makes it so that women aren't out of the labor force for such a long period of time. Men are able to kind of half shoulder the burden as well. He also does point to the fact that there are many high-performing women nowadays. As a whole, 40% of women now make more than the median man. In other words, 40% of women are making more than half of all men. So good job. He also says that the median man's income with a high school diploma adjusted for inflation was $1,017 a week in 1979. And in 2019, it is now $881 a week, which is 14% lower. And all of these manufacturing jobs that may have only required a high school diploma in the past don't really exist anymore. Rather than just saying, hey, the wages are lower, I think we should be focusing on finding ways to initially train people into vocations that still exist and that do pay well, or retrain people who may have lost manufacturing jobs, give them the opportunities to gain more skills so that they can earn a better income. I do see this as a problem, however, due to how oppressive the cost of higher education can be and is becoming, and how nowadays even a bachelor's degree is beginning to not be enough to land a decent job. So it's going to be a bit of a tough sell to tell men with already poor and falling grades that they need to go into thousands of dollars of debt and 6 or more years of education to get a master's degree in order to have a shot at being above average. That's just not going to sell for a lot of people. Going back to redefining the traditional role of fatherhood, from my own personal experience, I do think I was pretty lucky because I grew up with a mother who worked in construction and a dad who was a school teacher. So immediately out of the gate, I have already kind of smashed any old traditional gender biases that may plague some people to this day. And I think growing up in this less traditional household where my father would usually be home before my mom kind of gave me a different way of looking at the world, and I guess maybe a more progressive way of looking at the world. I think it's a great example of what future households could look like if we were to reassign some of these distributions. And I'm not saying it's just going to magically happen. We obviously have to put funding and programs in place for it to happen, but it is just an interesting example from my own life. He also talks about how marriage rates in general have been falling, especially among those with only a high school diploma. And he mentions that marriage seems to be more of a choice for those who are already doing well to pool their resources together to raise children, rather than the necessity that it used to be in the past. He also mentions the decline of something called shotgun marriages, which is when you have a child outside of wedlock and then you get married specifically for the purpose of raising the child so that they can kind of have a stable family environment. Another interesting fact about men's role in family, and specifically, we were just talking about marriage, so now let's talk about the other side, divorce. Men tend to have smaller networks than women do and tend to fare worse after a divorce than women do. All of this to say is that it turns out that men need women more than women need men. So to quote something from the book, economically independent women can now flourish whether they are wives or not. Wiveless men, by contrast, are often a mess. A survey ranked 58% of men versus 47% of women, saying that marriage now or in the future is very important to them. Meaning that more men now think that marriage is more important to them, or is very important to them in the future, than women do. So it really shows how that has flipped as well. He also goes on to say that women tend to find more meaning from more sources in their lives than men do, which makes them more versatile to negativity in one part of their life, and they can turn to a different part of their life to kind of pick up the slack. So if you're having a bad day at home, you can go to work and still do a really good job. I think it's a really interesting takeaway for men specifically and how to approach things in life. So if you live a more varied life, it could allow more men to stay engaged and to feel good about themselves, even if one part of your life isn't working out so well. Pulling another personal example from my life, I find that when I just focus on one thing, and that thing isn't going well for me or hasn't really been showing me results, I end up getting extremely down in the dumps and unmotivated for the rest of the day. Recently, I've been kind of splitting my time between jobs, writing, making videos, going to the gym, getting back into doing some hobbies, and I feel much more fulfilled in my day-to-day life. The only part that I'm really missing is rebuilding a social network of friends, but I have noticed a massive change that if one of the tasks in my day doesn't go so well, I have lots of other tasks that I can turn to and try to do better there. It seems overall that women have figured this out a little earlier than men have. So to all my men out there, just try something different, add some variety to your day, and see if you can go with your friends to the pub every once in a while. There are many parts of the book that I don't necessarily feel all that qualified to be discussing. For example, he wrote about the extreme difficulties and challenges faced by black boys and men in the United States. And as a white guy from Canada, I hardly feel qualified to talk about that. But I do really recommend reading the chapter because it really does show how systemic of an issue it is in the United States, and he shines very important light on the issue. The next chapter also talks about something that's a bit of a more challenging topic, specifically how being born into a poor family or a family that has one parent instead of two can provide some significant disadvantages as well. He touches on how the neighborhood that boys live in tends to determine a lot more about their outcomes, whereas there's almost no correlation for girls. For example, if there's lots of crime in a neighborhood, a boy is more likely to do poorly both inside and outside of school. He then covers something that I thought was quite fascinating, and it talks about how government policies focus to help both cohorts, so boys and girls, doesn't really seem to be working for the boys. He specifically focuses on a place called Kalamazoo, Michigan, where there is actually a free post-secondary education program to everybody in the city. That's thanks to some anonymous benefactor. It appears that for one reason or another, this doesn't seem to help the men at all, and in fact, the men just end up costing the program money because they will often go into something and not finish it, and there are no discernible positive outcomes or returns on the program's investment. However, it's been an astounding success for women. He continues to show multiple instances where men just don't seem to be benefiting from programs that are not specifically aimed at them, but are aimed at helping everybody. So he mentions that it might be important to try to find ways that specifically address how men learn and how we could target them specifically as a cohort. He does focus more so on vocational and technical schools and how there aren't very many technical schools in the United States. He does point to more improved outcomes for boys at technical schools. So he does propose kind of increasing investment specifically targeted at boys, the same way that we have specifically targeted investment to helping women get into STEM. The next section of the book covered biology, and I already talked a little bit about it, but he does mention that men in general have more of a tendency, again, careful with that overlapping kind of bias, but in general, as a whole, on a population level, men have a tendency to be more aggressive, risk-taking, but those same tendencies can manifest in positive ways, making them more likely to take a risk to save someone's life. He does mention, however, that we have evolved pretty far. We have consciousness and we have the ability to make choices. Animals in the animal kingdom don't necessarily have the ability to make choices, but we do. That's not to completely discount the fact that biology is different. He mentions that in a lot of medical research and mental health research, women's kind of biology is a center of focus, and he wants to shine a little bit more of a light on the fact that when we are treating men's mental health, when we are treating different issues that men deal with from a health perspective, it's also important to take into account the biological differences, whether that's in brain development, chemical levels within our bodies, and that sort of thing, because it all comes from somewhere. And by choosing to ignore these things, we are doing a bit of a disservice to the populations that we are trying to help. There are some really awesome insights at the end of the book that talk about various things that I mentioned kind of throughout the book and changes that we can make, whether it's to policy, to the year and the age that boys start in school, to the funding for boys' education, and to specifically target boys' programs, the mental health thing that I just spoke about. And I think all of this is really good and really helpful. He talks about getting fathers more involved in the family life and paternity leave and making fathers equal to mothers in the family respect. Women no longer need men, but children still need their fathers. Overall, I think it was a really well-written book, and it brought to light a lot of things that I honestly didn't even know were happening. I didn't realize that there was a good chunk of society, like half the population, or whatever, a quarter of the population, that just seems to not be getting the attention that they deserve. We are just not using our societies to their full potential. We could be doing so much better. We could be improving outcomes, improving income, improving prosperity, and break out of these kind of vicious cycles of people not being able to get ahead. And I think a lot of the things that he proposes as potential changes are really good steps in the right direction, and I hope that some policymakers do decide to consider it, and that more of a focus is put on this going into the future. So that about wraps up the video and my thoughts on it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought about this kind of summary discussion style video in the comments. Leave it a like and subscribe if you thought it was interesting. Hopefully I did not offend anyone too much by making this video. It's never the intention. I just wanted to discuss something that I thought was interesting. Always open to a discussion. If there was something you think I missed, leave it in the comments. Thank you so much for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.